Hi lovelies, and welcome back to my channel. If this is your first time here, my name is Amy and I'm a cruelty-free makeup enthusiast. So in today's video we're going to have a Coffee Corner series discussion. So if you've never seen my Coffee Corner series, I do them every so often where we go grab a cup of joe, and this is the first time I've been able to go through a Starbucks drive-thru and grab one of these, so I am super excited. But we have a cup of joe, we can sit down, talk to each other kind of about current events or larger topics and have a discussion. I love to know your thoughts as well. And these tend to get a bit nerdy, whether I'm doing research for these videos. I wanted to really talk about this. So in today's video, we're talking about the Jeffree Star Cremated palette. So I'm not trying to convince anyone one way or the other. I'm not telling anyone to buy. I'm not telling anyone to not buy. I'm not trying to sway anyone's opinions about this. I actually want to talk about it in a bigger scale in regards to death and the concept of the macabre. So we're going to get really nerdy here. So if you don't mind, I'm actually going to keep looking down at my notes and I'm going to talk to you about the macabre. So I was a history major. I have a degree, a bachelor's degree in history, and then I attended postgraduate studies at Bristol University in the UK for my master's in history. So I wanted to talk about the macabre because this whole concept of death and cemetery imagery really brought me back to two classes that I actually took at Bristol, funny enough. And the first one was actually talking about the concept of the macabre. So I'm going to give you a definition. So the macabre is disturbing and horrifying because of involvement with a depiction of death or injury. In art, it's an adjective, which means having the quality or having a grim or ghastly appearance. The macabre works to emphasize the details and symbols of death. The term also refers to particularly gruesome in nature. So a lot of people can have really dark taste in movies. They're obsessed with macabre horror films, and that's what's kind of driven my interest in this topic. So we had talked about that. The macabre or just, symbolism with death in art and film and photography has been something that we've seen for a very, very long time. It's kind of ingrained in a lot of our culture. And, I see it when I think of macabre mixed with gothic, because I know Jeffree described this as a gothic palette. So you see it in things like Shakespeare. There's a lot of grave digging in Shakespeare. There's a lot of dead people walking around in Shakespeare. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Brontes had a lot of dark things. Like if I think of Wuthering Heights, Heathcliff goes and digs up Kathy's body and she's really just a skeleton, but he sees her as like in the flesh. Jane Austen's Northanger Abbey is quite gothic. If we look at it in a very innocent way, in Disney, there's the Haunted Mansion. And it's funny enough, I pulled up, because I remember going to the Haunted Mansion with my husband down in Florida at Disney World. When you go in the line to go through and like when you're waiting to get on the ride, there's all these cemetery, like these gravestones, and on them they have like a typical rhyme. So one says, "Here lies old Fred, a great big rock fell on his head." So it's about all the way these people died basically while you're going in. And this ride is like meant for children, and this ride has been around for like over 30 years. They have a lot of the same stuff. It's not scary really because kids could go on it, but there's also the really old Disney old skeleton dance, which is like black and white, and the skeletons are kind of dancing around in the graveyard, and that's something that's very, very old. When Disney was still in black and white, I think about the hearse in Ghostbusters when we're talking about film. I also think about Tim Burton films. In Beetlejuice, there's the handbook for the recently deceased. When they're in that new office to kind of get their new handbook, there's the woman who's in green and she's like, "Oh, I wish I knew about this before I had my little accident." And she's got the cuts on her wrist. recently, Penny Dreadful, the original series, was very much filled with a lot of either death, cemetery, macabre kind of imagery, especially gothic imagery. There's also a really wonderful film called The Seventh Seal by the famous Swedish director Ingmar Bergman, and I remember I saw this in a medieval class that I took, and they still play it every now and then on TCM, which is Turner Classic Movies. It is a fantastic movie, and the concept basically is that a Swedish soldier comes back from the Crusades, and when he arrives back in Sweden, the whole country is just being bombarded by the Black Death. And throughout the film, Death is a person, and he's like he's like a hooded figure. I'm trying to describe him, and he follows him everywhere he goes, and he plays, chess with Death, and and 25 million people died from the Black Death. It was an awful, awful thing. So we see death has been, depicted in art and film in either very serious ways or, again, very funny ways. If you want to talk about like maybe Beetlejuice or Disney's Haunted Mansion or Ghostbusters. There's also a lot of beautiful ways that death has been depicted in films or how we understand death. And immediately my mind kind of goes to the Disney Pixar film Coco, which is a beautiful film. If you have not seen this movie, it's on Disney Plus. It is fantastic. It's all about celebrating Mexican culture, but it deals with the Day of the Dead and that concept of on that day, the idea that ancestors come back home, they could come back and be with their families. And the animated film deals with death and memory and family so well, and there's also really good music in it. It's not a musical, but the character plays music in it, and I can't highly recommend that movie enough. And then makeup-wise, when I think about Day of the Dead, I think of Melt's Amor Eterno collection, which is all about that. There's skulls everywhere, but it's like full... Although it deals with death, it's full of life and it's colorful and it's beautiful. In photography in general, too, I think of Annie Leibovitz, who is probably one of the best living photographers right now. She's done beautiful series, very cinematic series in graveyards before. So when I saw the teaser pictures for these, I actually thought these were kind of quite beautiful. They're very reminiscent of like a very cinematic scene to me. These pictures were taken in the Hollywood Forever Cemetery, which is a very, very famous cemetery. So a lot of famous people are buried there, and you can actually go take tours. People have like they show movies there, I think. So it's like this whole thing where people get dressed up. And bringing this back to when I was working on my master's degree, there's a very famous cemetery called Arnos Vale in Bristol, UK. So when I took a public history course, we actually went to Arnos Vale. Not only cemetery services, but they have woodland weddings there. You could get married at the cemetery. They have yoga there. I remember them saying that they have this beautiful buildings on site where they hold yoga classes, and they're like, we try to encourage people from the community to come here. And there's also a cafe that's there that you can go and eat, and underneath the cafe, I remember after they finished the tour, they're like, our old crematorium is down there and you can go and look at it if you want. And I remember I peeked into it and I was like, yeah, this is a little uncomfortable. The idea of filming in a cemetery to me is not offensive. I think it's been done so many times. And also a lot of cemeteries use their land for different reasons, not just for burials. And cemeteries can be quite beautiful places too to go to. When I was an undergraduate, I took a yoga class, and my yoga teacher wanted us to walk as well a couple of days during the classes. And so when it was getting like warmer in the late springtime, my university was very close to a cemetery. So she would take us for walking through the cemetery, and there was a beautiful pond there with little ducklings. I remember seeing a dad and his son there feeding the ducks. And it's... I think that cemeteries can be good reminders too of both death and life. So bringing this all back to the actual makeup palette, I don't think it's necessarily like totally macabre in the sense that it's not gruesome, it's not gory. There's no real intense imagery here, but I do think it has a gothic element to it, and there are macabre elements to it just because it does relate and symbolize death. So I do want to talk about the actual makeup. when I think about what he said in the video, he's like, no one's done this before, but this isn't necessarily the first grayscale toned palette that I've ever seen. Immediately what I thought of was my Lime Crime Venus Immortalis palette. This is a gorgeous, again, kind of gothic palette, but you do have the Botticelli Venus marbleized on here. So you see the marble in Jeffree's palette as well. And then you have these beautiful, like this kind of stone statuesque, I don't know if these are just cherubs or whatnot, and then the filigree around the corner. So this kind of imagery is very reminiscent of that. And then you have a beautiful, cool tone palette. Let me see if this will come on focus. There you go. So that's a beautiful grayscale palette. And I actually listed this on the, if I could only keep 10 palettes, it would definitely be this one. I love this palette. I also think about the V Cosmetics Cremery palette. I've always wanted to try V Cosmetics, and this is very much a grayscale palette, and it has a little pop of green in there, which Jeffree's does have a greenish shade in this palette, which I think is quite interesting. So it's definitely not the first grayscale one. I know Makeup Revolution, that one of the Makeup Revolution brands did a whole like grayscale as well. I'm really happy that cool tones are becoming a thing again. And when I think about like makeup inspired by death stuff, again, there is a handbook for the recently deceased from V Cosmetics, and then I also think of Lunatic Cosmetics. A lot of their stuff is very dead girl inspired. Most of their palettes are in the shape of a coffin. This is just the facial palette here. This is the Pro Contour palette. But again, you have this kind of these seams ripping and this eye coming through. And I know their most recent palette, what was it called? The Descendant palette is again in a very big coffin shape. As for the palette itself, I do find it interesting that it goes from the darkest shade to the lightest shade, where most palettes are vice versa. I think you can get actually a vast array of looks out of this, not just smoky, but there are some lighter shades that would be very pretty for like bridal makeup. The shimmers are actually very interesting to me, but the one that I'm most drawn to is actually a matte shade called Inheritance. It's like a grayish green shade. It's a very interesting shade. I don't think I've ever seen it before. It does appear that it does show up on both light and dark skin tones, which I think is quite nice. I think you're going to get an ashy look regardless, because that's what ashy is. This is what ashy is. It's a gray tone. So I don't really have any particularly strong feelings about this palette either way. You know, I'm not just gonna go and buy it. I've used several Jeffree's palettes, eyeshadow palettes before, and they're very, very nice quality, but I know he's a very controversial person, and I know that during this time, this can seem like it's in poor taste, and I completely understand where people are coming from in that case. I do think it's just unfortunate timing. I think someone said they had researched it. He had actually filed the trademark for this back in September of last year, and it was already in production. It was supposed to come out this April, and I think that if what was going on in the world right now wasn't happening, I'm not sure people would have the same reaction, just because I see all these things about death and imagery in our art so many times. I feel like people wouldn't be as surprised about it, but maybe that's just me. Maybe that's just me being a history person and a cinephile and like a consumer of the arts. So I'm throwing this question back to you and about how you kind of feel about everything. What do you think about the palette in general? Do you think it's overtly macabre? And knowing what we know about macabre and gothic themes pretty much throughout history and in our culture, do you find that this is in poor taste? So I'm very interested to know. Again, I don't have any particularly strong feelings either way about it, but I do find it a very, very interesting subject. So sound off down below. Please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy this content. Until next time, remember to stay compassionate and chic. Bye.